Hey guys, we are now getting ready to go over our notes for Job. So, my recommendation for you all is to listen and pay attention to as much as you can. Also, I guess if you want to take a few notes, there'll be a few things on here for the test. Not a lot. Of course, we will definitely go over some of the stuff in class. Just want to give you the basics. So, as we talk about the book of Job, there's a few things that we need to knock out of the way. First of all, Job is a drama. If you guys like a good study on drama, then Job is definitely the book for you. There's a lot of people intimidated by this book, and I get that. It's a difficult book to read straight through because there's a lot of chapters here and a lot of speeches, a lot of sermons given, really, a lot of lectures, and some of it you have to take with a really good grain of salt. For instance, Job has three friends. One of those friends is Eliphaz. He is the oldest and supposedly wisest of Job's friends. And some of the advice that you hear from him is not good advice. And so you have to take all of that stuff very carefully. So let's go over the characters. First of all, there's Job himself, obviously the central character. There's some debate of whether or not Job actually wrote this book, and it's entirely possible. In fact, I would say it's likely that he wrote it, at least to the part where he dies at the end, because obviously he couldn't have written it after that point. So it's good. It's a good way of thinking about it. Maybe help you understand this a little bit. But obviously, Job is the main character in this. He's the one who is going to deal with the suffering. Of course, there's Satan. Satan is a central character in many of the books that we've already talked about. But especially in this book, Satan shows up. Let me read through the description on him. It says, originally created as an angel of great power, Satan was filled with pride and rebelled against God. In this book, Satan tries to get Job to abandon his faith. And the reason I'm pointing that out to you is because there's a lot of mystery, a lot of misconception about who Satan is. And you see a very unique perspective on Satan in this book. So if you read the first few chapters of this, you will come away from with the idea about who Satan is, what his powers are. And so it gives you a little bit of an insight that you don't get into the other else in the Bible. One of the questions that pops up as you read this book, and it's a common question that we as Christians, as believers, should take into account, is the question is, why does God allow good or bad things to happen to good people? And I think Job is a fantastic book to read as far as discovering the answer to that. And we will discover why here over the next few minutes. A couple other characters you need to know about is Eliphaz. I mentioned him a minute ago. He's the oldest and supposedly wisest of Job's good friends. There is Bildad, another of his friends. Zophar, Z-O-P-H-A-R. And then the last one, the young man who listens to this debate, Eliah. He is a young man who sits and doesn't talk throughout most of the conversation. Most of the dialogue does not take place there with him being involved in that. He just sits and listens. And then after all of this is over, Job and his friends have gotten done talking to each other or talking at each other at times. It's actually his voice that speaks up that in some ways shows up as being some of the most godly words in this book. So I recommend reading his section, chapters 32 through 37, because some of his explanations are some of the most fantastic ones, which is a good idea for those of you my teenagers, my class, my students. That's a good section for you to read because it shows that wisdom can come from youth, can come from the unexpected sources. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this book. There's some controversy that surrounds Job. There is, if you go to a seminary or a theological school, there's a lot of people teaching that Job should not be taken literally, that it was written completely as an analogy, that it's all symbolic. There's lots of problems to this. Historically, that doesn't work. We're not going to treat Job as if it's some sort of symbolic story. We're going to treat it as if Job was a real, literal, actual human being who walked the earth, who suffered, who went through exactly what's being described here. Not only is the book written in that way, intended for us to read it literally, but there's other sections of the Bible that reference Job as a hero. And I don't think that he would be recognized in that way by other other parts of Scripture if he was not an actual literal human being. Now, there's some discussion about who wrote this. Moses, as an example, is thrown out there, and that's absolutely possible. Maybe Solomon or another prophet later on, for instance, Ezra. And again, all those things are entirely possible. It's also very likely that this book was written way before any of those guys and then passed down through the Israelites' history, which is why it ends up here. Now, we are unable to date this because we don't know a whole lot about when Job lived or where this took place. One of the clues that we do have when we read this book, though, is that it doesn't allude to any of the laws of Moses. It doesn't allude to any of the history of Israel. So that does kind of give us a clue, gives us an idea that this is probably a really ancient story, a story that took place prior to any of those other events, which actually, if you look at it, predates this book as to maybe making it possibly the oldest book of the Bible. So, which is the way I'm going to tell you guys, is to treat it as such. I don't know if you guys have ever had me in any of my drama classes, but as you guys know, I like to study some Shakespearean plays. I don't love all of them. But if you read Job, Job is much like a Shakespearean play. You've got all the key characters. And like a Shakespearean play, there's a lot of drama. There's a lot of tragedy here. And it's easy to get stuck up in the tragedy and miss out on the main point of all this. There's a beautiful passage toward the end where Job has suffered. He's dealt with all of these terrible things that have happened to him, and then he reaches a point where he looks up and he's talking to God, and he's basically acknowledging the fact that he's like, look, God, before I knew about you, but now I have experienced you. I've seen you with my own eyes. And it's a beautiful book that really helps us to understand and realize that, look, we're not guaranteed anything in this world. You guys are living through the COVID stuff and the difficulties that are going on out there. And that's teaching us, right, that we, even as believers, we're not exempt from the troubles of this world. And if you read Job, you'll see a very similar type of mentality. All of Job's family is taken from him. All of his possessions are taken from him. Even his own health is taken from him. And he's left sick and dying, and he just calls to God and he says, look, it'd be better if I'd never been born. And then you see him come to this realization through this conversation with God that his life does have a purpose and that he is to give God the glory. So there's a way to break this down. As you guys know, I like to break this down into parts. We're going to actually call each of these parts acts, like in a play. So for those of you guys who are obviously used to our play stuff, Act 1, this is where things go from bad to worse, or good to bad, bad to worse. Okay, basically, Act 1 is all tragedy. It's all bad. Okay, and you get into seeing exactly what Job is going through, and this is chapters 1 through 2, and this is Act 1. Okay, Act 2 is where we get into the dialogues. So this is where if you're a student of the play and you're familiar with monologues, you get a lot of these right here. Okay, where one character speaks and talks and gives a long message, and then another character takes his turn and gives a long message, a long talk. And this is where Job interacts with his friends. And this is probably the reason this section is why a lot of people are intimidated by the book of Job, because it's a section that lasts from chapters 3 all the way to chapter 37. And so you get a lot of things, a lot of misquotes. And also want to caution you guys, if you're ever doing a ministry of any kind, this is one of the reasons I always tell young Christians, young believers, don't just look up a topic or look up a word in the Bible and then try to find a verse. Because I've seen ministers before actually will Google a word and they won't really understand the context of it, and they'll pull something out of Job, and it might come from really bad advice from one of his friends, as an example. I've shared the story before with you guys before, but I'll share it again. I was in a Christian bookstore one time, and they had printed out a bunch of Father's Day gifts. And on these mugs, they had a verse quoted from the book of Job. And what they had done was they looked up the word father or fatherhood or man, and they just printed out the first thing I guess they came across. And so this verse that they had quoted had come from the book of Job, and it said, this man that you have set apart is protected. I'll have to look it up. It's in the book of Job. But unintentionally, they were actually quoting Satan. They didn't take the time to look up who they were quoting. They just looked up the word man and stuck it on a mug and thought, oh, well, this sounds really good. But it actually was Satan mocking God. So we got to be really careful when we're drawing from this book. The last section of this book would be Job 38 through 41. And I know some of you guys are like, wait a minute, there's 42 chapters in this book, but we're not going to actually call the last section an act, and I'll get to that in just a second. But 38 through 41, we get another type of dialogue here, but this time, instead of hearing from Job and his friends, we get to hear from the actual central character of this book, and that is, of course, God. And this is where God speaks up, and he has a message to give Job and to those who are listening, of course, us as well. So God breaks his silence, and he tells us exactly what he thinks about all of this, and he kind of wakes Job up. And then the last section, which is the very last chapter of this book, and that is Job 42, this is what we're going to call the epilogue. And this is where everything that Job has lost, it's restored. And so remember I talked about how the very first act is where things go from bad to worse. Well, now things go from bad to much better. And so you get the story of redemption, the story of love. And I'm hoping that you guys will study Job a little bit in your spare time. Take a look at this. Hopefully, over the next couple of days, I will post some more videos on these individual books of the Bible. If you have any questions, guys, please feel free to email me, and I will respond to those questions. Like I said, you don't need to know every single detail of the book of Job, but if y'all will review this, so that way you'll be prepared for tests when we get back, that would be fantastic. All right, guys, thank you all. I'm praying for you guys.